Hey, folks, welcome to the Tech Strong Gang for today. I'm Mike Vizard, your host. Joining me today is Dan O'Brien, who's president and COO of the Futurum Group, and Chris Blask, and also new member, Kate Scarpelli. She's been on the show a couple of times now, but if you haven't caught a couple of episodes, Kate is a security expert and does a lot of work in app dev. So, plays both sides of the ball, as they say. Folks, welcome to the show. We're going to have a little chat up early here now about what's going on with all these tariffs, because if you're like me, I'm having a hard time, frankly, keeping score. Lately, we've now seen that there's going to be tariffs maybe going into South Korea and Japan, but then we're waiting to see what happens with Europe, and it looks like the tariffs themselves were delayed. Dan, a lot of folks in IT right now are trying to figure out their budgets for the coming year. And it's July, and a lot of them are ending their fourth quarter coming up at, I think it would be September-ish. It's very hard to plan in this environment, but what's your take on what's going on here, and what should IT folks be thinking about?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Not sure we'll figure it out here today, but hopefully we can shed a little bit of light on kind of what's going on. Listen, I think the big theme is, negotiations will continue until tariffs improve, right? That's kind of, the path we're headed down still. Deals in place with Vietnam and the UK, bit of a partial deal with China, and really still trying to work it out with the rest of the world. Kind of under the microscope more recently, seems to be Japan and South Korea, and obviously, of major concern to the tech industry, given the prominence of firms like Samsung in South Korea and Sony and Tokyo Electron and many others in Japan. Disruption and, uncertainty in the supply chain, not a good thing for anybody. Really hard for business planning, really hard in terms of understanding, where pricing may come in. And so, I think we're all still trying to figure out where this goes. It feels like we've kind of had this July 9th date out there for a while. That's tomorrow for those checking the calendar. Seems like we're going to push that to August 1st in a lot of cases. So a lot of tough rhetoric out there, not a lot of progress. And, really, I think a lot still up in the air. But, South Korea and Japan most recently under the gun, and, also a little bit of ire towards the BRICS countries, right? And, kind of the extended tail that's associated with them. As they added a lot of countries last year. The targets keep shifting, but not a lot of progress being made. Negotiations continue.
It seems to me, too, with BRICS, and you brought that up, but the C in BRICS stands for China, and I thought we had a partial deal, and yet now we're threatening anybody who kind of is associated with BRICS, and it's just a little more confusing than ever.
Well said. Yeah. Maybe that's the partial part of the partial deal. But it's an interesting collection of countries for sure. Obviously, you've got Iran in there with, the countries that were added more recently, South Africa, Ethiopia, many others. Definitely a bit of a tough group to negotiate with for the United States at this point in time.
Chris, here's my question to you, and you've worked in cybersecurity for years, but do I pay attention to any of this stuff, or do I just ignore it and plan and kind of this is just some sort of black swan event that may or may not happen, but I kind of just can't plan for it, so I must ignore it?
Well, you can plan for anything, right? And as you know, here, I've discussed enough of this, over the years, but I've worked all over the world, and you can plan this in Yemen. You can plan this in Colombia, which is much more stable, but it's not, traditionally as stable as a first world country. And you just have to understand the dynamics, and this, the narrative is the hero's return, the Odysseus story, right? We're coming back, and, the homeland has been overrun. So every day and every week and every month, there has to be a story of rooting out the traitors. And this, it sounds a little silly on a global economic or a national economic level, but this is an example of it, right? There's 90 deals in 90 days, or no deals in 100 days, or 2 deals in 3 days. It doesn't matter. If it's inside the narrative of the hero's return, then every morning when we wake up, there's a hero story coming to root out the whatever. So, and again, you can plan for security and operations in war-torn countries. And the U.S., fortunately is not that at this point, but narratively it kind of is. You're planning operations and budgeting. Assume that there may be some hero return story next spring where tariffs go up 700% on the left-handed countries that were mean to us last week.
I love your analogy because part of my soul says that this is, a fictional story here designed to create those heroes. And if I look at the math around what the existing deals are, they haven't really moved the needle on the tariffs one way or the other very much. So, Kate, should I just assume that the tariffs are going to be relatively stable, give or take a couple of percentage points, and proceed along?
We really don't have a choice, right? Other than to proceed, because if we just stop, what happens then, right? So we have to move forward with the littlest that we can move forward with. We don't have a choice, in other words. It's concerning, right? In that sometimes I wonder, are we going to negotiate ourselves out of everything and we're going to be left alone, just standing and being like, because nobody's going to want to play with us? I mean, I wouldn't want to play with us. Like, if every day I woke up to a different strategy, how is that a strategy? Like, and that's what I feel like is we're expecting globally. Like, literally, there's like a new strategy every day. And how do we, as a company, I couldn't imagine trying to make a strategy with a new strategy every day. Like, that in itself doesn't even make sense. So how do we get partners and solidify deals in what tomorrow may be a country that is going to get hit with a very high tariff? I being in cybersecurity, I don't know why I didn't like the term resilience. But gosh, do we not need resilience right now? Do we not need to have this type of strategy where, okay, maybe I can't do a deal with this country and I have to shift really quick, and maybe have multiple areas where we can take from, but that's hard to manage, right? So
This is there's a news show in the tech world and so forth, and I think a lot of people have opinions on this, and I certainly have mine. I'll be happy to talk about them here. However, right, it's, as a security person, I'm always coming into environments and saying, all right, I know you stated what you want. I need to tell you what the reality is. Here's what is on the table for you as an organization, as a company, as a person, whatever it is. And I find, look, I'm an American citizen, born and raised. I live in Canada. My family's Canadian. I've traveled the whole world. And it pains me to say this, but this is the U.S. U.S. right now, Maya Angelou said, when someone tells you who they are, believe it. Right? The administration right now includes people like Stephen Miller, who has stated he'd like to see a U.S. population of 100 million. And we have an administration that very specifically wants to have zero trade deficit with everything. And that's not a global trade system. So it's an isolationist world, isolationist country, where you can't really realistically do long-term business as an American company with international companies, because the conditions absolutely will change, and they probably won't change in a positive way. So if you put yourself in that world and try to plan around that, it may not come out with a lot of good results, but it's the world you need to be in, I think.
Well, as Mike said, though, the deals we're seeing really haven't changed that much from the prior reality. And I think that, the market has certainly written off kind of the anchoring strategy to these negotiations, right? We've kind of set the bar so far to the extreme that kind of nobody believes that's actually going to hold for the long term, right? That's largely how kind of the world's behaving. I also wonder, how much of what we're seeing is kind of the full story of what's going on, right? I mean, we're talking about tariffs, but it feels like there is a broader kind of resetting of the global order and the relationships we have across a lot of different vectors beyond tariffs that's kind of happening here as well. So I don't know. I take a step back from kind of the daily news flow and the confusion we're all kind of wrestling with in terms of the daily narrative. And I kind of say I think we've anchored really hard. I think the market's discounted that. The reality of what we've actually seen come through is actually pretty pragmatic and not all that different than prior. But also, it feels like there's something bigger at play beyond just tariffs here.
Dan, I think also IT leaders need to get in front of this a little bit, because there's a history that says, the amount of money allocated to IT is usually a percentage of sales. But if you keep thinking in those terms, you won't realize that how dependent upon the business is now on IT. And so maybe the budget for IT is actually larger, especially when you count in all the folks who are spending money in given departments. But is it time to have a more realistic conversation about just how strategic IT is to businesses?
I think it is, Mike. I mean, technology is the source of competitive advantage in, almost every industry now. So, I do think a slowly increasing, kind of IT budget as a percentage of sales, particularly as we enter the AI era here, that's probably the reality for the companies that win in the long term. You can resist it in the short term. I'm not sure that's going to lead to more competitive advantage in the long term, though.
And I do agree. And Chris, I do like, talking about level setting expectations. And then that is, right, something that has to be done. And I think, to Dan's point, definitely AI could, as much as, we fight against this, but we definitely have to incorporate that into our strategy.
Yeah, I mean, listen, all the levers change, right? If IT goes up, well, R&D as a percentage of sales may go down because we're getting greater developer efficiency with coding tools, right? G&A sales may go down as we're automating a lot of the back office, right? So, I think everybody's afraid of taking IT up too far, but if you've got the offsets in other parts of the organization, I mean, I think cloud did this really well, right? Cloud made everybody kind of understand the financial model of we're going to shift CapEx to OpEx. I think with AI, you're really talking about shifting, G&A and R&D potentially, more into the operational tech spend. And that may be a fine reality, but, without the offset, I think it's a tough conversation for people to stomach.
Well, I just want to loop back with a more positive note because I think I laid a lot of gloom there. However, you'll find out if you're a first world country person, you go to a third world country, that business actually doesn't stop, right? I think what American companies need to get in is their minds is the buffer a lot of variability. I think you two are right. The tariffs are a lot of noise. Whatever they are now is probably about the same. But don't be surprised if they suddenly spike up 7,000% in your area. But you survive a lot of crazy things as businesses, right? Just don't fool yourself.
Another way to look at this, to Dan's point, there are top lines and bottom lines. And if the top line is going to suffer, there's going to be a lot more focus on making the bottom line better. And that's where IT folks can shine. So I'm just saying maybe now's a good time to get in front of the whole thing, right? All right, folks, we'll be back in a minute to talk about our next topic.